They're the world's most infamous serial killers.
It was the largest numbers of deaths attributable to a single mass murder in American history.
Here it was, all-American boys killing all-American girls.
But what drove them to commit their horrific crimes?
The victims had been cut open and their organs had been removed.
Was it nature?
Her father was reportedly a sex offender.
He's the most deranged fellow I ever met.
Or nurture?
The father stood and broke the mother's fingers one by one in front of the children.
Ted Bundy would savagely snuff out the lives of America's brightest and most beautiful.
It was almost as if he was on a mission.
The dispatcher said, "Sarge, we've got 2 dead and 2 dying."
A charismatic killer who fooled even his closest friends.
Well, I just been with the most dangerous man in the western states. Never had a clue.
And ran rings around law enforcement.
He was a master predator. It was as well planned as military action.
He's become the most infamous serial killer in American history. But was Ted Bundy born to kill? Ted Bundy was born Theodore Robert Cowell in 1946 at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Vermont. 22 years old at the time, his mother Louise faced the social stigma of having a child out of wedlock to a mysterious absent father.
In order to protect his mother, her parents felt that they could not acknowledge the 3 months that she had spent in the Home for Unwed Mothers in Vermont. So he was raised believing that his grandparents were his parents, his mother was his older sister, and in his life that had to have been very confusing to him. He didn't know who he was.
When Ted was 4, the mother he thought of as his sister took him to Tacoma, Washington to start a new life. There she married a military cook, Johnny Bundy, who adopted Ted as his own. It was in this environment of half-truths and uncertainty that Ted Bundy grew up.
His high school days, he was in a crowd where everybody else was a big wheel, but he never was.
We do know that he was terribly teased. He was considered not a nerd, although he was a somewhat handsome young child, but he didn't fit.
His basic personality, if there was such a thing, is shy, afraid to take chances, probably afraid to give away his inner thoughts.
In adolescence, Bundy finally discovered for himself the truth about his parentage.
Everything he'd previously been told to believe was in fact a lie. In those circumstances, it would be natural to distrust. It would be natural to find it very difficult to form lasting attachments to those people who had lied to him.
The young Bundy began to get in trouble with the law, committing a number of petty crimes and struggling to hold down a job. But in 1966, he enrolled at the University of Washington in Seattle and suddenly appeared to blossom.
He was considered charming, he was considered well-dressed, he was considered educated, and at that time, that was the only thing that people really paid much attention to.
Ted was popular at the University of Washington. His professors thought he was great, that he was brilliant.
Research has shown that the prettier people get the better grades and the better placements, and the not so pretty people don't do quite so well. And that, I think, came to the point where people, because he was such a handsome young man, basically overlooked any type of emptiness that was the core of him.
Anne Rule, now a best-selling author, was a volunteer at the Crisis Clinic, a suicide helpline, when she met the attractive, charismatic young Bundy.
Ted and I would work as a team. Ted was wonderful on the phone. He sounded caring. He was interested in people. I can still picture him hunched over the desk with a phone to his head. And many times we saved lives, which seems very ironic to me now. But I got the sweet Ted, and who would walk me out to my car at 2 in the morning when my shift was over. And he'd say, "Ann, please lock the doors. I don't want anything bad to happen to you on the way home." Well, I'd just been locked up with probably the most dangerous man in the western states. Never had a clue.
Dan Lazares, a young law student, shared the same boarding house as the seemingly bright and gifted Bundy.
The Ted Bundy that I knew, there were things about him that were special, I would want to say. Charisma. I remember thinking what a handsome man he was, and probably wistfully myself, wishing that I were so. I remember him being well-spoken, intellectual, unassuming, arrogant but unassuming, in the sense of, I would say, disarming.
While Ted was at the university, he met the woman of his dreams, and he told me, "She's everything I want." She was beautiful, she was rich, she was popular, and he was really in love with her.
But after more than a year's romance, Bundy's dream girl began having second thoughts.
She realized that Ted wasn't going anyplace. He didn't have any real, he'd talk about politics and he'd talk about being a lawyer, but he really wasn't going anyplace. He wasn't carrying out things. And she broke off with him. And that just devastated him. That was the catalyst, I always thought.
Bundy took that rejection very badly and then went out of his way to find a way of wooing her back.
Bundy threw himself into the dynamic world of law and politics, gaining a reputation as a rising star of the Republican Party. All the while, he refused to give up on his dream girl. By early 1974, the now seemingly high-achieving Bundy had won her back so completely, they began talking of marriage. Then, abruptly and unexpectedly, he broke off all contact. On the 1st of February 1974, beautiful and musically gifted 21-year-old student Linda Ann Healy had been due to record her daily ski report for the local radio station. She never arrived, nor did she turn up for classes that day. When she finally failed to show for a family meal, her housemates began to worry. The police were called, and what they discovered was puzzling.
She disappeared. Her bed was made, but when they pulled her bed back, there was enough blood staining the mattress and the bedding that someone had to either be dead or seriously injured. She had been in her nightgown because there was blood around the back of her nightgown. He'd taken that off and dressed her. She was just gone.
Over the next 6 months, the Seattle police wrestled with the mystifying disappearance of the 21-year-old. Then one after the other, more young female college students began vanishing. 19-year-old Donna Mason was last seen heading to a concert. She never got there. 18-year-old Susan Rancourt disappeared as she walked across Ellensburg, Washington State College campus at night. 22-year-old Roberta Parks vanished from Oregon State University. 22-year-old Brenda Ball disappeared as she left the Flame Tavern in a district of Seattle. And 18-year-old Georgianne Hawkins, who was only days away from completing her first year of studies, mysteriously vanished as she walked between sorority houses after visiting fellow students.
All she had to do was come down 4 houses between that and her house. She never got down.
Each victim had center-parted, long dark hair. Each was slim, attractive and bright. Each resembled Bundy's dream girl.
Generally, there is a lot of similarity among victims of serial killers. Serial killers in general have a type.
It was almost as if Bundy was trying to gain revenge over this particular woman, a particular class, a particular type of woman. It was almost as if he was on a mission.
6 young women had simply disappeared, leaving behind only a question. How had they been abducted with seemingly no struggle, no clues, and no witnesses? As Bundy's reign of terror continued, the chilling answer would be revealed. (1974). In and around Washington State, 6 bright, attractive young women had been abducted by serial killer Ted Bundy. The girls had simply disappeared, leaving law enforcement confused and without a clear suspect. How was Bundy kidnapping his victims unnoticed and without a struggle?
He knew he had to create access to a suitable victim. But how would he go about being able to convince this woman to come with him in the car, to walk with him some way away from where she might be socializing with her friends?
The mystery was about to be revealed. Lake Sammamish State Park was a popular hangout for Seattle's young men and women. On July the 14th, 1974, teenager Dawn Sanders was one of many young girls heading to the lake.
Well, it was a nice, sunny, warm Sunday afternoon. We always like to go down to the park as much as possible, and my girlfriend and I, typical, we were 14, 15 years old, headed down to the park to see who was there and what kind of trouble we could get into, basically.
That Sunday in July, it was really hot, and the state park was always crowded on hot weekends. They would line up in their cars trying to get one of the few parking spots at the state park, and it's a very large park. It's one of the busiest in the state.
A friend of ours was approached by a young man in a cast. He asked her to help him get something off the roof of his car.
The girl was one of several to be approached by a man with what looked like a broken arm.
She was 17, beautiful, shoulder-length brown hair, brown eyes. She didn't go with him anywhere. It didn't go any further than that.
It's likely the man was Bundy, wearing a fake plaster cast. Witnesses saw the same approach made to an attractive, lone 23-year-old.
Janice was sitting on a towel by herself, and a good-looking man came up to her and asked her if she would help get his canoe off his car. And he said, it's just up in the parking lot. She said, okay, and she went with him. That's the last time she was seen.
The nature of Janice Ott's disappearance would provide an insight into how Bundy had abducted at least 7 young women without so far drawing attention to himself.
What Bundy did seemed to me to be incredibly clever. He would wear casts on his arms. He'd pretend to be injured in some way and ask for help. Now, of course, what this is doing is simply creating access. Once he has that access, he uses the opportunity that that access gives him to facilitate the kill.
But the extraordinary events of the hot July day would not end with the disappearance of Janice Ott. Only hours later, as 40,000 people revelled in the sunshine, Bundy was back and roaming freely amongst them.
A little later in the afternoon, Denise Naslund was there with her boyfriend and another couple. And she had to go to the restroom, and it's kind of a concrete little box sitting off by itself. She went, never came back.
Bundy had abducted 2 young women from the same busy location on the same day in broad daylight.
The psychological gain that he got from the first murder wasn't enough to sustain him. He needed more. Serial killing starts as a consequence of a fantasy. The fantasy becomes refined over time. So 1 ultimately wasn't enough. The fantasy demanded that 2 were necessary.
Using helicopters and dogs, the police began a massive search of some 400 acres around Lake Sammamish Park. Not a trace was found. The girls had simply disappeared.
I recall her boyfriend who'd been at the park with her that day. I remember him being there during the search and leaning on his car and just crying, just sobbing that it was, fearing the worst.
But Bundy's audacity had betrayed him.
The park was so busy that day that it was easy for them to put together some profiles that quickly identified this person that they identified as Ted.
People at the park heard him introduce himself to Janice Ott and saw her leave with him.
Within that week, they had a composite sketch of the man that they believed who turned out to be Ted Bundy.
When I look back on that day now, I don't remember it as innocent as it was.
Despite having a name and description for the suspect, no one who knew him would connect the charismatic young Ted Bundy with the man who'd now abducted at least 8 women.
My friend and myself commented when it came up that summer that there was a clue, somebody by the name of Ted that had a Volkswagen, and we commented and joked that maybe it's Ted because he's never here, but of course that was really something we didn't consider because of his characteristics. You would never imagine that he would be involved in something like that.
If serial killers came with horns on their heads, we could avoid them. Unfortunately, serial killers are often very charming, very seducing. So we shouldn't imagine somehow serial killers are Hollywood devils, because actually it's the banality of evil that we're dealing with in serial killers.
By mid-September 1974, Bundy was on the move. He headed to Salt Lake City, where he'd enrolled at the University of Utah to study law.
He went to Utah, and girls started disappearing in Salt Lake City suburbs around there, much in the same way that girls had been disappearing in Washington State.
Over the next 3 months, 4 young girls were discovered sexually assaulted and murdered. Bundy was seemingly unstoppable.
It was as well planned as you know, a military action. Every time he selected a murder to do, he had procedures that he followed. He had certain tools that he brought with him. He had everything laid out completely, and he thought through all this stuff. He did very well at getting away and avoiding being arrested and avoiding law enforcement. He was a master predator.
But in November 1974, Bundy made his first major mistake.
He attempted to kidnap a young woman named Carol Duranch in Salt Lake City. Alleged to her that he was a police officer, that there had been an attempt to steal her car. And when they couldn't get into a back door of a mall where he said was the police substation, he took her over to his Volkswagen and attempted to drive away with her. She figured something was happening when he tried to handcuff her, jumped out of the car, of the moving vehicle, and was able to escape.
Carol Duranch had escaped, but her attacker was still on the loose. Over the next 7 months, 6 more young women were abducted in Utah and neighboring Colorado. But on August the 16th, Bundy's luck finally ran out.
An off-duty Utah State police officer saw him prowling around a neighborhood in the Volkswagen, stopped him. They charged him with possession of burglary tools. Were able to use his photograph in a photographic lineup, and Carol Duranch was able to pick him out.
Ted Bundy had been caught. He was charged and convicted of the kidnapping of Carol Duranch and sentenced to between 1 and 15 years. But Ted Bundy was about to pull off an extraordinary feat that would see him free again, to kill at will. In 1977, Ted Bundy had been convicted for the attempted kidnapping of Carol Duranch in Utah. Police were now convinced Bundy was a serial killer and moved him to Colorado to face charges for the abduction and murder of 24-year-old Karen Campbell in Snowmass. Bundy was to be tried in Aspen. If convicted, he would face the rest of his life behind bars. But Ted Bundy had other plans.
He petitioned the court to allow him to defend himself, and by doing so required that they would take him out of the setting as a normal inmate and put him into, say, the law library or places that weren't as secure as what his cell might be.
On June the 7th, 1977, during a recess in the case, Bundy asked to be allowed access to legal research material.
He was acting as his own counsel. He was working in the law library of the courthouse. He jumped out the window and fled.
Bundy had outwitted his captors and was free. He blended into the crowds on the busy Aspen streets and headed for the surrounding mountains.
Bundy would interpret that as his ability to overcome the criminal justice system. He would see himself as cleverer than all those police officers, all those detectives who allowed him access to the library so that he could do research for his upcoming court case.
For the next 8 days, Bundy hid in the wilderness, sheltering in disused cabins and stealing food from campers, while embarrassed law enforcement frantically searched for him.
There is a self-centeredness about serial killers where they see themselves as the most clever, as the most talented, the most intelligent, because the whole world revolves around them.
After days in the wild, Bundy audaciously walked back into Aspen and stole a car. But his luck was about to run out.
He had approached a police roadblock and was observed. They went back when he U-turned, went back and chased him down, placed him under arrest.
Bundy was returned to Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. Security was raised, and authorities were confident they had the prisoner safely interred. Again, Bundy had other ideas.
He was always thinking. You had to keep that in mind when you dealt with him.
On December the 30th, 1977, Ted Bundy made his move.
He lost weight. He was able to move aside a neon light fixture, slid up through the ceiling, went over to the ceiling of a closet into the jailer's home, and dropped in there.
By the time his jailers discovered he was gone, Bundy was already 1,000 miles away in Chicago. After spending New Year's Eve in a bar in Ann Arbor, Michigan, Bundy took a bus to Tallahassee in Florida. With a new identity, he rented a room in the Oaks Lodging House, in the heart of the Florida State University student area. After 18 months of imprisonment, Bundy's scheming had paid off. He'd made fools of the law and was finally free. But for Ted Bundy, it wasn't enough.
Serial killers love being at the heart of the drama that's unfolding around them. When Bundy moved to Florida, he no longer had the status that he was able to follow vicariously in the print or broadcast media as he would have been able to do in Utah and Colorado or Washington. He was a nobody again rather than a somebody, and that's what Bundy ultimately wanted to be. So he has to do something again to gain the attention that he craves, so he can demonstrate his gross form of power over the culture that he abhors.
In the early hours of January the 14th, 1978, just 1 week after arriving in Tallahassee, Ted Bundy struck again.
About 3 o'clock in the morning, a young woman named Nita Neary was returning to her sorority house. She entered the downstairs. She saw a man run out of the house, carrying what appeared to be a stick in his hand. She went upstairs and awoke the sorority president when Karen Chandler walked out of her room. They turned to Karen and said, "Did you see?" and realized that Karen was bleeding.
Jim Sewell was a sergeant and assistant to the chief of police when his phone rang that night.
The dispatcher called and said, "Sarge, we've got 2 dead and 2 dying."
Sewell was the first plainclothed officer on the scene.
When I got to the house, upstairs, I went into Bowman's room. Margaret Bowman had been strangled and was dead upon review by our officers.
A nylon stocking was tied tightly around Margaret Bowman's neck. She'd been clubbed with a branch, so hard that her skull had been shattered.
It was everything you think about a beating victim, what she would say.
Across the hall, another victim was discovered.
Lisa Levy, she had also been beaten and appeared to be strangled.
20-year-old Lisa Levy was in bed, dead, lying on her side, the covers pulled up over her shoulders. She'd been sexually assaulted with an object. The attack had been savage.
Lisa had also been bitten on the breast and on the buttocks.
2 more girls, Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, had also been bludgeoned. They only just survived the brutal attack.
All the built-up feelings burst out in a shark frenzy in that sorority house. There was a shark frenzy.
The serial murderer doesn't have boundaries, so it's as if a trigger is set off and they become not angry, they become rageful to the point that when you see the viciousness of the killings that they commit, you're taken aback. You think, well, how could this mild-mannered person do such horrendous things to another person, a human being?
It had been just 2 weeks since Bundy had escaped from Colorado. Almost 3 weeks after the Chi Omega attacks, a white Dodge van was reported stolen from the media department of the Florida State University. 4 days later, it would resurface 100 miles away in Lake City. 12-year-old Kimberly Leach was attending junior high school. About to start a PE lesson, she realized she'd left her bag in her homeroom. She was given permission to return to the other building to get it. She did not return. That morning, a witness saw a young girl, close to tears, being pushed into the passenger seat of a white van by a scowling man. He assumed him to be an angry parent. That same morning, another witness saw a white van swerving, almost out of control, on the highway, the angry driver shouting towards the passenger seat. Just days later, the white van that had been stolen from the university in Tallahassee was recovered.
Whoever had driven it had driven some 500 or so miles. And we found signs of trauma in there. There were branches and leaves and hair and fiber evidence. Price tag with a $26 figure on it. We think that he went by Green Acres Sporting Goods store and bought a very large knife, which was a hunting knife, and we believe that he used that when he killed Kimberly.
It would be 2 months before police officers discovered Kimberly's 12-year-old body dumped in an unused pig pen in woods 25 miles from her home. At 1:30 a.m. on the 15th of February in Pensacola, Florida, a man was spotted in his VW Bug, acting suspiciously.
An individual driving a Volkswagen was kind of loitering behind some stores over in Pensacola, was observed by a police officer in Pensacola, tried to stop him. The guy ran first in the car and then fled the vehicle, and the officer chased him down. There was an altercation. A shot was fired, missed the person, but he was taken in custody. Initially, he told us that his name was Ken Meisner. Then later on, he told us his name was Theodore Robert Bundy.
Those that had known the charismatic young Ted were dumbstruck.
When Ted Bundy was arrested, I was absolutely flabbergasted. I remember my stomach dropping out.
Ted Bundy was in custody again, but his capture would spell just the beginning of an extraordinary 11-year circus. (1979), Florida. Ted Bundy had abducted and murdered dozens of young women across 5 different states and escaped from capture twice. Now he would stand trial. Bundy would be tried twice. First for the brutal attacks on the students in the Chi Omega sorority house in Tallahassee. Then for the kidnap and murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach in Lake City. On the 25th of June, Ted Bundy took the stand.
Please state your full name for the record. Theodore Robert Bundy.
The former law student, against the advice of his counsel, had decided to defend himself.
Serial killers are desperate to be at the heart of the story. Defending yourself clearly is going to allow you to draw a great deal of attention to yourself. And Bundy, of course, had this fantasy that he was a very good law student and could have been a good lawyer. This is all part of the fact that serial killers often operate on a surface level. They don't have the depth to commit to a period of studying for a law degree. So it's all surface, it's all froth, it's all fantasy. But by engaging in that fantasy, by defending himself, he's at the heart of things.
You say you knew Theodore Robert Bundy on August 16, 1975?
What we have to prove in a criminal case in the United States is, in essence, guilt to beyond and to the exclusion of a reasonable doubt. He thought he could create this serious doubt and that he would be found not guilty. He was very sure of himself. He asked very good questions. But he didn't learn the first lesson in law school. The first lesson you learn in law school is never represent yourself.
Defending himself, Bundy chose to cross-examine vulnerable witnesses and victims, a tactic that forever damaged his image in the eyes of the jury.
In the adversarial world of the courtroom, his lack of knowledge, his inability to defend himself because he's guilty, is going to be laid bare. So this is really one of the miscalculations, it seems to me, that Bundy makes.
Don't shake your finger at me, young man. Don't shake your finger at me, young man.
During the trial, two events would seal his fate. Carol Durant positively identified Bundy as the man who tried to kidnap her from the shopping mall in Utah. Most damning of all would be the bite marks recovered from the body of Lisa Levy. Anne Rule attended the trial. She still found it hard to believe the friend she'd once worked side by side with on a suicide helpline could possibly be a savage serial killer.
The afternoon testimony came from Dr. Richard Souveron, who is a forensic dentist. He testified that Ted had bitten two of the Chi Omegas and left teeth marks in the breasts and buttocks of one of the dead girls. Our teeth are almost as good at identifying us as our fingerprints. And Dr. Souveron was explaining where all these marks and how they matched exactly with Ted's. He had very unusual teeth. And he said there's no question but Ted Bundy bit this girl either before or after he killed him. The court was over and Ted was walking out of the room, and he was always handcuffed and manacled. And he was carrying his files, as he usually did. And he looked at me and he went, like, I didn't do it. I have no part of this, but I knew he did do it. I went down the hall and threw up because I had to accept it at that point.
Theodore Robert Bundy was found guilty beyond reasonable doubt.
Ted Bundy's fate is now in the hands of Judge Edward Cowart. The judge will announce this afternoon whether he will send the former law student to the electric chair. Yesterday, the jury heard Bundy's mother ask that her son be spared, but the state reminded the jury of the victims.
How nice it would have been if Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman's mother could have been there on the morning of January the 15th of 1978 and asked for mercy for them.
Bundy was sentenced to death by electrocution. But the conviction would be just the beginning of years of schemes and appeals as Bundy's celebrity grew on death row.
When he would talk to you, you'd have one face that would be looking at you, but you always felt like there was a game going on.
Law enforcement had lists of missing girls that they and their families wanted information on. But all the while, Bundy continued to plead his innocence.
The serial murderer doesn't necessarily want anything more than to demonstrate that he is the most valuable individual at that point in time. Getting them all wound up, getting them to the point where they're frenetic about getting him to confess to his crimes. But all the time, he is in total control of his world. And that's basically what it is, total control of the world.
Only when facing almost certain execution, after 11 years on death row, did Bundy finally start to confess.
He lied to his family about it. His mother and his wife at that time completely thought he was innocent. And in the last couple days, he told them the truth, that he had committed these murders. It wasn't a big humanitarian effort on his part. He wanted something out of it, and I'm sure it was probably, if it only took prolong his life for another few weeks or whatever it was, that he was able to manage.
Just days before he was to be executed, Ted Bundy began admitting the hideous murders of at least 36 young girls across America. He had dumped many of the bodies in the mountains or in woods, and he had often returned to them to commit necrophilia. He had sometimes brought the heads home. Ted Bundy was executed by electrocution on the 24th of January 1989. But was this killer of innocent young women created by nature or nurture? Was he damaged as a child by the lie that his mother was his sister? Was his latter rejection by his dream girl the catalyst for his crimes? Or was Ted Bundy simply born to kill?
I've never wanted to believe in the bad seed, that a child is doomed from the beginning. But if a child with the tendency to violence is born into an abusive household, then you have the perfect soil to grow a sadistic sociopath. He wasn't crazy. He was not crazy. He knew what he was doing. He covered his tracks. But he was addicted.
There seems to be some indication that even when he was a child, he had no real close emotional attachment to anyone. The basic personality is there when the child is born. It's acted upon by the environment. So was he born to kill? There had to be something in this child's genetic makeup that said, all you need is this certain environmental trigger, and then you'll be able to start your fate.
I've absolutely no doubt that Ted Bundy had a set of circumstances in his childhood which were very unusual and potentially incredibly damaging. Ted Bundy was not born to be a serial killer. It was a choice that he made as he grew up and felt that there was no other way of resolving some of his underlying psychological problems.
Bundy himself gave Corrections Officer Paul Decker a chilling insight into the motives for his crimes.
He was resting and kind of relaxed at that point, and I said something to him about, Ted, why did you, what did you do all this for? And he says, I liked it. There was no discussion about, oh, it was a mental problem that drove me to it, or any kind of a thing like that. He just enjoyed it. It's a terrifying thought.